Lovely. Ollie, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Very well. Lovely island in the background, which will make sense as we
Yeah,
proceed with this topic.
very
Great.
interesting.
Lovely. So we will talk about the ontological argument for God's existence. So I thought we could just start off by very, very briefly outlining what this argument is. Are you happy to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. The ontological argument, as we understand it, first originated with Anselm, St. Anselm of Canterbury,
Mhm.
and by its very nature, which is ironic that we're talking about ontology,
Yeah.
it's an a priori, it's a deductive argument, so it's analytic, right?
Yeah.
And it purely relies on our understanding of logic.
Yeah.
So let's just kind of break some of those words down straight away. So analytic, we're looking at like based on logic, based on kind of um, the definitions of things. So I
Yeah.
love this term by definition. So for example, a triangle by definition has three sides.
Yeah.
You couldn't have a triangle with four sides. That would be, illogical. That wouldn't be the case.
Yeah.
Um, and when we think of the word like a priori, and this is probably a little bit embarrassing, especially it fits with my second years, because actually they're allowed to drink. But I always think of it as pre something. It happens before an event.
Pre-drinks.
Pre-drinks, exactly.
Love it.
Post-mortem for a posteriori, but a priori is like pre-drink. So before you go out, before the main event,
Yeah.
before you know how catastrophic it might be, you start with the pre-drinks.
I love that example. I might have to steal
No,
it.
please. So yeah, a priori, it's knowledge before or without evidence,
Yeah.
which is again in contrast to the other arguments that you might look at, like the teleological or the cosmological, for example.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So yeah, it's non-empirical, which means again without evidence.
Hmm.
So we should be able to, according to Anselm, um, without having to view or witness or experience God, rationalize and then come to the agreement that he exists.
Yeah.
Um,
Perfect.
so let's have a think about that. So Anselm, so just a couple of other bits and pieces. So when we talk about deductive arguments, for example,
Hmm.
where it's our classic kind of if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, therefore A is greater than C.
Yeah, good example.
Really tight, Socrates is a man,
Hmm.
men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Yeah.
Um, Other bits and pieces, and this is where I think where students start to grasp it is, if I say, oh, Gary is a bachelor,
Hmm.
bachelors are unmarried men, therefore Gary is unmarried. Well, we've
Yeah.
never had to meet Gary. We've never had to experience Gary. We've never had to come into contact with Gary, but we know something about Gary now.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
or again, a bit more in the abstract, which is, think of, I want you to picture a three-sided shape. Triangles are three sides. So you're all thinking of triangles. You haven't had to draw it for me. I
Yeah.
haven't had to see the literal triangles you're thinking of, but we all know they're triangles.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important where Anselm is starting because it's so different to perhaps the other ones that we'll look at or that you'll probably discuss at another time.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a really crucial way to frame this understanding of the argument, because I think a lot of the time, I don't know about your experience, but when I've taught students the arguments for God's existence, they, in my opinion, more intuitively pick up on the other arguments that are based on empirical evidence and observation. But
Yeah,
like you say, Anselm, at least in his mind, and we can talk about, criticisms of this, the way that I often phrase it is that he's arguing that you can understand this without any reference at all to the outside world. You can come to this conclusion that God exists simply by sitting in a room by yourself, not looking at anything, just purely thinking about it through logic.
yeah. And that, as you say, is something that we'll definitely come on to criticize.
Yeah.
But I think, and that's again, I love kind of focusing on our definitions with
Mm.
students, and it's ontology,
Yeah.
study of the nature of something.
Yeah.
So, we're looking at the nature of God. So
Hmm.
again, as you say, Anselm thinks that we can sit down in a room and just by looking at the definitions of God, we can prove he exists.
Yeah.
Whether he's successful in that, we'll judge it by the end, I imagine.
Yeah, for sure,
Um,
for sure. Yeah, and I like that idea as well, that it is important to define your terms, because it can get a bit confusing, I think, for students when you've got all these different terms like a priori, ontological, deductive, all of these things can be a little bit overwhelming and they sound very fancy, but I often think in philosophy, if you break the terms down, they're a lot simpler if you just describe them in those terms. So yeah, ontology, it's the study of the nature of something, and I guess in this case, it's the study of the nature of being, right, and existing in itself. So maybe we could start with that now that we've sort of established, the difference between a priori, a posteriori, in contrast to the other arguments. Should we talk about Anselm's presentation of the argument, like how he actually puts it forward?
Yeah, definitely. So I think we have to remember as well, Anselm is assuming the Christian God. But
Yes.
this is probably true of the classical God of theism. So that's your
Mm-hmm.
four omnis
Yeah.
and eternal and transcendent. So let's
Yeah.
just kind of position it there. So it's kind of universal in that regard. If we just think of God, we kind of all agree on where we start with that.
Yeah. Good.
He is obviously he's a bishop, and he starts from the position. He says in the Psalms, even a fool, knows what the concept of God is. In the Psalm, it says, "The fool says in his heart there is no God." The fool has a concept of God; he just rejects him.
Exactly. Yeah, that's
Um,
crucial.
yeah. So if everybody has a concept of God, that's where he can start in Anselm's mind. And he first begins to define what God is. And for Anselm, God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. And that's
Yeah.
kind of like the key phrase for all of the ontological arguments that you'll ever study.
Yes.
God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. If you can think of something better, it's still God. That is.
Yeah. Exactly. The greatest thing you could ever imagine in layman's terms, if you like. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So the greatest being,
Mm-hmm.
for Anselm, then, if you can conceptualize the greatest being, that's great.
Yeah.
But it'd be greater for that being to exist in reality than in the
Yes.
mind alone. So for then Anselm, he makes that jump then to say, well, if he exists in the mind and it's greater to exist in reality, well, by definition, he must exist in reality as well.
Yes. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the greatest thing. And we know that he is the greatest because God, by definition, is the greatest thing.
Absolutely. Therefore, God exists. I think it's really well demonstrated through the analogy of a painter.
Yeah.
So when a painter sits down to make their artwork, make their masterpiece, they might have a conceptual idea of what it is,
Mm-hmm.
and it's only made great when it's actually there on the canvas. So
Yeah.
it's great that it's in the mind, but until it's actually out there in the world, it's still not as great as it could be. And that kind of is what Anselm was trying to get at.
Exactly. So God fits into two types of existence, as it were, which is that he exists both in the mind and in reality. And the reason that the latter is true is because he is the greatest thing. And according to Anselm's logic, in order to be the greatest, you have to exist. So could we say that therefore it's a necessary existence that God has in that sense?
Absolutely. And he later goes on, there's a criticism by Gaunilo, which we'll come on
Yeah.
to in a minute. And he gets a bit annoyed about that and responds back with, yeah, that, God would, if God exists, then God would have to exist necessarily.
Yeah.
And he says, I'm just pulling it up now, for it's the same kind of argument about existing in reality than in the mind alone, which is a contingent being must rely on something else. That's the definition of contingent, right?
Yeah.
But it's greater to be a necessary being. Well,
Yes.
again, if God is the greatest thing ever, well, he would have to be necessary by definition.
Yeah, exactly. Not depending on anything or anyone else to exist. Unlike, for example, we as human beings, we wouldn't exist unless other things came into the situation and sort of made us exist. Whereas God, that doesn't apply to him, basically.
Excellent. Yeah. I mean, again, going back to our classical idea of God, eternal, has no beginning or end.
Yes.
So for Anselm, that has to be part of that conceptuality, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, just on that key word for a minute, because one thing, I don't know if it's the same with your students as well, mine often get a bit confused between eternal and everlasting. And I often say to them, well, actually, eternal is even greater than everlasting, because everlasting just means last forever, but could have had a beginning, whereas eternal is without a beginning or an end, which again feeds into this idea that he is in fact the greatest.
That's a really excellent kind of a separation there. I've never really kind of made that clear for my students, so I'll have to go back and do that now.
Nice.
But yeah, absolutely. It's again this idea of the Christian God plays such a fundamental role for Anselm.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, this idea of this fundamental being that exists necessarily, because
Yeah.
it's greater to exist necessarily than contingently.
Yeah.
Which again, he thinks he's done his job now. He thinks
Yeah, exactly. And it's
um,
quite succinct if you think about it as well, isn't it? Like it doesn't actually take that long to talk through his main points.
no.
And he's sort of like, job done. But like you say, you know, we can question if the job really is done. And of course, Gaunilo did, didn't he? He sort of came back with this island criticism, as it's known. So should we move on to that and talk a little bit about what he said about, you know, why he wasn't a big fan of this argument, despite the fact that he himself was a monk and of course did believe in God. He just didn't really like this argument. So should we think about what his objection was?
Absolutely. I mean, brilliantly, he writes his piece is called "On Behalf of the Fall,"
Yeah, I love that.
which is, I think, such an excellent kind of little dig.
Yeah, I agree.
Between monk and bishop. Brilliant. So yeah, he uses the example of an island, but with my students, and hence your background, with my students, I get them to go a bit mad, and well, but the logic's the same. So
Yeah.
Gaunilo points out that you know, you can define anything as the greatest version of itself. So again, he uses the island. So the lost island is the greatest island that, you know, can be conceived, so much so that no greater island can be conceived. Again, it's greater for this island to exist in reality than just in your mind alone.
Yeah.
Therefore, the greatest island exists in reality. We can see there that kind of it's the same flow of logic, it's the same reasoning that's being applied.
Yeah.
But you can do the same with the greatest carrot or the greatest chair. You know, you can put anything in there, so much so as long as it's the greatest thing and it's better than everything else. Of course, you can rationalize anything to exist.
Exactly.
No.
Exactly. So it doesn't really matter that it's an island in that sense, does it? That happens to be the example that Gaunilo used, but actually we could do it about absolutely anything. And I think his reasoning behind that, from what I can glean from it, is to show how kind of ridiculous this is. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think in some ways, if you want to be really posh and fancy in your essays, guys, you might want to even turn it into what we might call a reductio or a reductio ad absurdum.
Yes, good point.
Reduced to the absurd.
Yeah.
You know, he's demonstrated here that we can prove that the greatest island exists. We can prove that the greatest carrot, the greatest chair, the greatest whatever exists.
Yes.
In reality, we know that's not true.
Definitely. I really like the idea of tying in that term reductio ad absurdum as well, because the point of that is to show that if we apply that logic to other things, it comes across as ridiculous. So even though Anselm was obviously very confident in his formulation, and at a surface glance, it could sound like you say, job done, when you apply it to other things, you see quite how ridiculous it is.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, again, Anselm really was happy, as you say, really happy with this. And this, you know, before he responded back with the necessary and contingent stuff,
yeah,
he was like, no, this is great. This is fantastic.
I'm done. Yeah.
I'm finished. Yeah. Like I've proven God. I've done my job as a bishop now. I can retire. I'm happy. But again, you know, it's when we look back at Anselm's response to that, his argument is, well, you know, islands are contingent. You know, they're contingent on the earth, they're contingent on the universe, it's contingent. Whereas God isn't. God is a necessary being. You know, God, it can't even be thought that God can't exist.
Yes. That's the thing I take issue with a little bit, because to me, I mean, and I think this is where students, like I say, intuitively find arguments like the cosmological argument and teleological argument a bit easier, because you can base it on observation rather than pure reasoning. But the idea that God can't not exist, does that seem a little bit, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems a little bit like he's cheating, using that as a kind of premise to then argue that God does exist. That's always struck me as a little bit cheeky in a way.
I would completely agree with you.
Great.
You know, what you mean? You can't possibly conceive of a world where God doesn't exist? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It just seems a bit bizarre that you're going to say, do you know what? I've done it. I've done this marvelous job of proving that God exists definitively. But my whole premise of my argument is that he can't not exist.
Yeah. And to disagree with him otherwise is to question the whole nature of Christianity, the whole nature of God. it's a massive problem for
Yeah.
Anselm, and I think that's in some ways purposeful, which is a shame, really, because I think it's a very interesting idea he's kind of tackling.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a bit problematic.
I agree. And even like, I mean, again, we know that it's from some, but using that idea of, the fool as well, it's almost to say that if you don't agree with this, you're a bit of an idiot, so
Yeah,
to speak. And it's a bit arrogant, perhaps, to say the least, but I think flawed. So, and it's one of those ones, and I guess you could apply this to the other arguments for God's existence as well. But if you disagree with any of the kind of premises, like for me, I sort of boil it down into three components, right? So God is the greatest thing you could ever imagine, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, in other words. Point two, the greatest things must exist in reality, not just in the mind. Point three, because God is the greatest thing you could ever imagine, he must also exist. If you just get rid of one of those points, the whole argument crumbles. Like, and I think Kant says that, if I'm not mistaken, you could say that God is the greatest thing you could ever imagine, but you don't have to accept that God exists. And that's where he kind of brings in, this is obviously going much later than people like Gaunilo, who I think was a contemporary of Anselm's, but Kant's the one that sort of brings out this idea that actually existence is not a predicate. So maybe we could deal with that as a criticism. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think this is a genius response by Kant, because obviously, Kant himself, was he Christian? Wasn't he Christian? That's a disputed in some circles, agreed upon in others. So
Yeah.
well, that's a different conversation for a different day. But yeah, existence is not a predicate. What does that actually mean? It's a really good argument presented by Kant. And let's do a bit of a thought experiment for the listeners.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine 100 gold coins. We might call them thalers, which is the coin that Kant would have used back in Prussia.
Yeah.
Imagine 100 gold coins, and they're shiny, they're round, they're quite heavy, smooth, they're cold, and they exist. I haven't learned anything more about these coins just by saying they exist. And Kant claims that there's no difference between 100 thalers, 100 coins, and 100 thalers that actually exist.
Yes.
Because when we're dealing with them in the world of predicates, we're describing them because it's sensory experience.
Mm-hmm.
What Anselm is essentially kind of presenting here is he's trying to give us information about something that cannot be shown without some sort of evidence.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and it probably helps students to know as well that predicate is a grammatical term, but effectively it's exactly like you said, it's anything that gives us more information. But of course, Kant's argument is that there's no additional information gleaned from saying these coins exist when you've already described other characteristics of the coins, like they're shiny, they're gold, they're hard, they're cold, which are in fact predicates. They do tell us something about the thing that's being talked about.
Excellent. Yeah, I think, and this is the challenge, is because Kant has identified that no new information is given.
Yeah.
Well, the whole point of proving the existence of something then becomes pointless almost.
Yeah, exactly. Redundant. Yeah.
Yeah. You haven't achieved anything that you set out to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, like I think he gives an example that we use is, the cat sat on the mat.
Yeah.
Well, we have information about the fact that there's a cat, there's a mat. We know that the cat sat on the mat. But if I said, oh, and the cat and the mat exist.
Yeah. No
okay,
point.
And
yeah, exactly.
Great, fantastic. What do I do with this now?
Yeah.
So yeah, again, as you say, predicates are information, but again, saying something that exists, there's nothing we can do more with that now.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't tell us anything extra. And
No.
that's the tricky bit. So yeah, I think there's lots of grounds upon which you can refute this, which of course we've seen with, Gaunilo and Kant, or criticize rather. So, the other thing that I think often gets overlooked, I mean, maybe I'm missing something in the scholarly sort of debate here, but this idea that God's the greatest thing you could ever, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, that the argument that I often sort of think about is, surely that's a subjective idea. Like, even the idea that the greatest things have to exist in reality, do they? I don't know.
And that's a further criticism by Kant, which is
yeah.
I mean, it's Kant accepted that a necessary existence would belong to the concept of God.
Yeah.
That doesn't actually mean that God exists.
Exactly. And it doesn't mean that you have to accept that almost inherently in the way that Anselm does.
Absolutely. And I think what's really clever, it's not begging the question, and I want to make it clear, but it's a very similar line of argument where if you take the three lines that you identified, which I think are really succinct and really clever, and put if God exists before them,
Yeah.
it doesn't really change the argument.
Yes.
And
good point.
so, if God exists, God would be that which nothing greater can be conceived.
Yeah.
If God exists, the greatest thing would have to exist in reality than in mind alone. Therefore, by definition of God being the greatest thing, he would have to exist in reality. Yes, if God exists.
Yeah, hypothetically speaking, exactly. That's a good point.
In some ways, again, he's not begging the question, but he's assumed the reality that God exists to prove that God exists.
Which to me is bonkers. And again, that's maybe me just sort of like putting across my own view on this, but I've always kind of thought that. So something that I'd love to get your opinion on actually is the strength of this argument, because even though we've, I think, brought in scholars and we've identified our own issues that we might have with this argument, it's still been incredibly influential, hasn't it? And in fact, I think I'm right in saying, I think Richard Dawkins is not a fan of this argument, which might be obvious for obvious reasons, but I think he cited an example of someone who actually converted on the basis of hearing this argument. So, they've gone from not being religious to believing in God. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on why this argument has had such an enduring impact, despite what I think we've identified and agreed on are quite glaring problems with it.
Yeah, I think it comes down to a lot of society, if I'm honest. I think, take the modern world, and people are so focused on rationality and logic and science.
Yeah.
And I think even thinking of people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, your four horsemen, and on YouTube, it's like, Hitchens destroys theists.
Oh yeah, very sensationalist language.
With logic. And it's like, okay, well, if we can use the same logic that these people is becoming sensational, sensationalized rather, then maybe that has that profound effect because we're able to meet on the same level. I also think it's quite clever for, you don't necessarily have to be a theist to engage with it. It's not a faith-based argument, which is
that's
where
true.
We see some other arguments failing because it's like, well, as an atheist or as an agnostic, I have no connection to that faith. I have no connection to God. It means nothing to me.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess the other thing that it doesn't do, which I think a lot of people would have issues with and make it even seem sort of less convincing, is if it were to say, well, it does say God is the greatest thing you could ever imagine, which I suppose is, I was going to say like it's a bit different to something like the problem of evil, where people might say, oh, but, why is there bad stuff happening? It's not necessarily trying to address that. But even the word greatest, it's like, is it? I don't know. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there's something sort of like compelling perhaps in the almost like cold use of logic there, like the idea that you don't have to refer to anything else. So there's something quite appealing about that. Do you think there's something appealing in the simplicity of it as well? The fact that it's, stated in a quite neat way, perhaps?
I think so. I think the fact that in 3 or 4 lines you can summarize and reach the conclusion God exists.
Yeah.
With, all right, some valid concerns, but for a starting point, it's incredible. And especially for people who perhaps haven't engaged in philosophy, religious studies, theology, if they're on that conversion, if they're on that kind of faith journey, that can be very compelling.
Yeah.
Like, you know what? Yeah.
It makes sense. Exactly. Yeah. And again, it might just be at a first glance. And then when you start to kind of unpick it, you can think, well, do I really agree? But I often think that's the case with a lot of things in philosophy. You hear it and you're like, oh, wow, that's amazing. Like something that I had actually when I was looking at these arguments for the very first time, when I first heard of the design argument, the teleological argument, I thought that. I was like, oh, wow, that's really clever. And then I kind of thought about it more and I was like, there's some problems with this. And again, I think that's the case with a lot of things really in philosophy, but again, that's a topic for another time. As we sort of near the end of this, I'd just love to get your overall thoughts on the argument, and also if there's anything else that you think would be useful to bring in here, that'd be great. So yeah, if we could just sort of sum up by you giving your overall thoughts and if there's anything that we've missed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think I'll bring in some other bits and pieces first, which would be helpful to link. Again, I teach AQA, so let's kind of make some links out there. Hopefully it will resonate with some other people. So yeah, obviously most scholars within the world of theology and philosophy have rejected the ontological argument for one reason or another. If we even look to Aquinas, he wasn't a fan. He said that any attempt to define God then limits God. And so
Great point.
link to religious language
Yeah.
with like via negativa and Maimonides.
Yeah, perfect. In fact, that wasn't something that I thought of directly, but that is a really good point because Aquinas, I think, is comfortable to talk about God in terms of, I think it's the analogies of attribution and proportion,
Mm.
but they are still elements of the via negativa. In other words, the idea that we can only talk about God by defining him by what he's not rather than what he is, because like you say, to talk about him using the via positiva, talking about things that he is, it limits him, and therefore, I guess tying back into Anselm, you can say that limits him from being the greatest being, doesn't it? Because you're using language to say what he is rather than what he's not. Great point. Yeah.
Similarly, like obviously Descartes
Yeah.
was very inspired and made his own version, which again, if anyone reads it, it's, in my opinion, word for word, in my humble opinion.
That's a good point, actually, because I think oftentimes, I mean, for example, when I was looking up Kant's objections, it said, just to be clear, he's objecting to Descartes' formulation of the argument rather than Anselm's. But maybe briefly we could sort of go over the difference between the two, because for me, I'm not sure that there is an enormous one, but maybe there is a little bit between Anselm's and Descartes' formulas for it.
Yeah, I think I think for me it's the placement for Descartes. Anselm, it's a standalone kind of part of this big work, his main work, if you will. Whereas for Descartes, by this point he's quite well published, he was quite well known. This is part of his meditations.
Yeah.
So he's in Descartes' mind, he's doubted all of his knowledge. He's then built this argument where he's proven he exists, proves the world exists, and now he's trying to prove that God exists.
Right, yeah. So it's the steps to get to that point. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the difference, is that he's almost surmising what Anselm says to kind of go, yeah, and by the way, I've done all this, and here's this as well.
Yeah, yeah. The context is different.
The context, massively different. And I think that's what's really interesting, is that he still follows the same lines of argument, despite, I would hope, that he would have been knowledgeable about Gaunilo's criticisms and other kind of criticisms that would have been thrown around at the time.
Yeah.
Obviously, he comes much later after Anselm. One final interesting perspective I thought was Karl Barth on Anselm specifically, which is that perhaps it's an interpretation of religious revelation, and it was far more subjective and far more empirical in nature. Not obviously because he literally saw God, but a more of a sensational experience, and that was his interpretation of it. Though again, this is widely disputed. So I think it's just a nice kind of it's a nice kind of perspective to throw in there.
I think so. And again, not to sort of go on too much about synoptic links, which I'm sure students get a bit fed up of hearing, but they are important, is of course it's a link to religious experience, if that's on your specification as well, which I know it is, at least for the OCR spec. But the idea, and again, it is kind of speculative, isn't it? Because how can we know for sure unless Anselm directly revealed that was a kind of personal revelation for him? He certainly, I don't think, presents the argument as if it is. I think he presents it almost as if it's a truism. But then equally, you could say that's kind of what happens to a lot of people who have religious experiences. They talk about things as if they know for sure what happened, even if it is personal and it's only something they experience themselves rather than other people. But the knowledge that they get seems to be something that they are very, very certain of, even if other people aren't fully convinced. That's a really interesting perspective. Yeah.
So I guess to kind of wrap it up, like you say, is my personal view on it is that of kind of, I'm with Kant a little bit, unfortunately. I'm unconvinced by it. I think it's an interesting start, and I think the way I start is I start with the ontological because I think it's a great method to get people into philosophy. In my mind, and the way we kind of schedule everything, it's the first opportunity for students and myself to really engage with some proper philosophy. But it has got some massive issues that it doesn't really overcome. And I think later interpretations and versions of it fall down the same holes. And I think ultimately and this is maybe a more damning view on all of the arguments, is any argument to set out to prove the existence of God negates the whole point of faith. And becomes incredibly problematic for Christianity.
Great point. And I often point that out to students, actually, this, as it were, a kind of discrepancy really between the sort of reasoning based, even empirical approach to trying to, prove, as it were, that God exists versus that more faith, blind faith, whatever you want to call it, the idea that you can just have like a feeling or a knowing that's personal to you without trying to prove it to the world, so to speak. So yeah, well, maybe we can talk about that, actually. I'd love to get you back on to talk about the other arguments, namely the teleological and the cosmological. I think that'd be great.
If you'll have me, that'd be great.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, well, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you again so much for joining. And yeah, looking forward to having you back on to talk about the other arguments and to see if we're more convinced by them.
Thank you very much for having me.
No worries. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye.